After seeing Chris's score, I decided not to tell him right away. I did tell all my other students, most of whom were beyond thrilled at their scores. I found it interesting that Chris didn't ask me to tell him his score. When we finally got back to my room and he got out his book to read, I watched him carefully, looking for a sign of some emotion. After a couple minutes of him reading, he paused to take a bite of his brown sugar granola bar, and I took that opportunity to ask, "Hey Chris, don't you want to know what you got on FCAT?" He just looked at me and said, "Yes?" Trying to keep a straight face, I slowly put up 3 fingers. His eyes got huge, and then he said quietly, "I made a 3? "Yes, Chris, you made a 3. You not only passed, but you scored on grade level." I started bouncing in my seat with excitement, but Chris remained very calm. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes, I am positive," I said as I shoved the FCAT report under his nose and pointed at his name and then his score. Chris seemed very nervous to celebrate, almost like he didn't believe me and didn't want to get his hopes up. Chris stayed in this odd mood for a couple of days. What finally pulled him out of it was the afternoon of Program Director Appreciation Day. The point of PD Appreciation Day is for us Corps members to show our PDs how much we appreciate the bazillion hours and gallons of sweat, blood, and tears that they put into our success as teachers. Josh is my PD, and my first idea was to buy Josh a flask, but that didn't seem A, appropriate, or B, meaningful. It then hit me that a PD's greatest success would not just be creating successful teachers, but rather creating teachers that led their students to great successes. I decided that a thank you from my students would mean a lot more than a flask from me. My students only know Josh as Miss Feigert's funny boss, Mr. C. So I ended up teaching an impromptu lesson on Teach for America that morning, with my objective being, student will be able to write a meaningful thank you note to Josh on PD Appreciation Day. To explain Josh's role in TFA, however, I had to explain why TFA exists in the first place. So I took about 45 minutes that morning going over the education gap with my students. We had talked about the education gap before, but that day we really dug into the hows and the whys. It was almost a religious experience for me. All of my kids were asking insightful questions that proved to me that they were A, listening, B, understanding, and C, actually thinking about what their peers and I were saying. What hit my kids the hardest was the statistic that 1 out of every 3 black males will go to prison at some point in his life. We discussed the reasons for this disturbing trend and how it affects them. Before that day, all of my students could have told you that it is so important to get your education and go to college. So our discussion built on that foundation, and we dove into topics such as making up for bad grades in the past, and financial aid and scholarships, as many of them expressed concern that they would not be able to pay for college. That discussion was by far the most meaningful and rewarding 45 minutes of my entire year. I could see my students really thinking about their futures in a way they had never before coming into my room. Anyway, everyone quickly got to work making their PD appreciation cards. Chris likes to take his time on projects like this. So once everyone else had finished, I asked him to stop for now and that he could finish in the afternoon. During lunch that day, I asked the class if someone would be willing to draw a picture on the front of the envelope we were using to hold all of our cards for Josh. Chris is known for his drawing ability, so everyone wanted him to do it. All of the other kids were watching Madagascar during lunch, so no one was really paying attention to Chris, who barely looked to operate any of his food. At the very end of lunch, Chris came up to my desk with the envelope. He looked incredibly nervous as he handed it to me for inspection. My eyes filled with tears when I saw what he had drawn unwritten. When I gave Chris the same reading test last week that I had administered at the beginning of the school year, when he scored a D, which is the kindergarten level, he scored an O, which is a middle third grade level. Chris had grown. Chris had grown 2.25 years in reading. By this time, Chris must have had a bit more confidence in himself, because when I told him his new level, he not only believed me, but he went nuts. I went nuts. The next day, my class had to take a writing test where they spent 45 minutes responding to a prompt. This time, the prompt was, tell about something you did that you will always remember. Chris entitled his paper, and I'm going to spell this for you, M-E-A-T, Miss Feigert. Meet Miss Feigert. He talks about shaking my hand on the first day of school and about being nervous about repeating third grade. He concludes his paper by writing, I don't know how, but I guess she saw into us that we can do it. Thanks, Miss Feigert, and I will never forget that day. The growth Chris made in reading is his to own completely. I was a first-year teacher. All year, I felt like a crazy person in a pitch-black hallway, bumping into the walls left and right, tripping over my own 2 feet, and sometimes turning and going in the wrong direction without even knowing it. So when I say that the growth that Chris made in reading is his to own completely, I mean that he earned that growth on his own. I handed him nothing. What I did do, and what I hope all of you will do, is I set high expectations and goals for Chris. I communicated clearly, strongly, and very often that I knew, not believed, but knew that he could meet those expectations and reach those big goals. And I proved that by simply being there with him after school every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, because I cared about him and because I was so invested in his success. I proved that by never giving up on him, and I proved that by never giving up on him, and by never letting him slow down. Finally, and most importantly, I proved that by never letting him give up on himself. So my final suggestion is not a survival tip, but rather my #1 success tip. This is probably the most important thing I can give you. It's also the most cliche and ideological piece of advice, but I don't really care. So my #1 success tip is to remember why you're here. My reason for being here manifested itself in Chris Dunson this year. I cannot imagine what it would have been like waking up at 4:30 a.m. every morning if I had not felt like I held Chris's future in my hands. Teach for America is not a job. To me, it's not even some commitment I made that I feel obliged to complete. I've discovered this year that Teach for America and everything we stand for is a lifestyle and an honest belief that our mission is possible. If you live Teach for America, you do not give up. You refuse to slow down because you understand that the need is so great. You are driven not by those students, but by your students, our students, who, like Chris, have so much untapped potential for greatness that you work your butt off every day and live by the mantra that every second counts. This is a huge responsibility, but you wouldn't be here if those who came before you thought you couldn't do it. You were chosen because you can and you will lead your students to success in school and in life. And trust me, come this time next year, you will be so glad that you did. Y'all have the next 6 weeks to absorb absolutely everything you can that might even possibly help your children learn to believe in themselves and to achieve at the highest levels. There are so many kids like Chris in Jacksonville that desperately need the amazing teachers y'all will soon become. So take advantage of every opportunity that you have this summer to learn how to teach them. And trust me, the lessons they teach you in return will change your life forever. I'd like to end with one of my favorite memories from this year. One beautiful spring day after school, Chris and I were talking to Miss Elrod, another 2009 corps member who teaches at my school. I don't remember exactly what we were discussing, but at one point, there was a lull in our conversation. And I remember, like it was yesterday, hearing Chris sigh and then say quietly, "God bless Teach for America."